Hey everyone, today we're drifting back to a quieter corner of history. The kind of corner that doesn't usually make it into school textbooks, but lingers in the shadows of dusty archives. Because we're talking about deserters, the men who looked at the great armies of antiquity, gleaming legions, thunderous phalanxes, intimidating cavalry charges, and thought, you know what? I'd rather not. And then tried to quietly wander off before someone noticed. It's a surprisingly common theme. For every glorious battlefield speech and bronze statue, there were plenty of soldiers sneaking away into the night, or at least daydreaming about it. And of course the real question is what happened to them afterwards. Well, usually, nothing good. But we'll take our time here. Let's begin in ancient Mesopotamia, because that's where the earliest armies we know about marched into existence. Kings of Ur and Akkad loved to carve dramatic inscriptions about their military victories, but they were less forthcoming about how they got ordinary farmers to pick up spears and fight endless campaigns. The truth was, most men in these armies were conscripts, drafted from the fields, handed a weapon, and told to march under the blazing sun in heavy wool. Imagine being a shepherd one week, and the next part of a military expedition trudging towards some distant city you've never heard of. Not exactly a dream career move. And yes, people tried to slip away. There are surviving Babylonian legal texts that describe punishments for men who deserted the levy. The penalty usually involved fines, land seizures, or forced labor. Which makes sense, because Mesopotamian kings cared less about bravery and more about not losing their taxpayers. A deserter wasn't just a coward. He lost revenue, and naturally that was unacceptable. Now let's drift west to ancient Greece, where desertion was still very much a problem. The Greek city-states loved to sing hymns to valor and carve praises to those who stood firm in battle. But plenty of hoplites, the citizen soldiers with their heavy round shields, were secretly hoping to head home before things got messy. In Athens, desertion was one of the worst crimes you could commit. There was even a word for it, lipotaxion, literally leaving one's post. Conviction could mean losing your citizenship, your property, and basically your reputation for life. That sounds dramatic, but remember, Greek armies fought shoulder to shoulder, shield to shield. If you slipped away, you weren't just saving your own skin, you were opening a gap for the guy next to you who now had to explain to his family why you weren't there. It was less every man for himself, and more congratulations. You've doomed the entire formation. Of course, sometimes men did desert anyway, especially if the cause seemed less than inspiring. When Athens was bogged down in the endless Peloponnesian War, more than one weary soldier decided that endless campaigning wasn't worth missing another harvest or another year of normal life. Punishments ranged from execution to public shaming. But perhaps worse than that, your name could be etched forever as a coward, and in ancient Greece that was about as socially fatal as it got. Now, of course, the Romans, the masters of military discipline, or at least the masters of writing about their military discipline as if it were carved in marble. In truth, Roman soldiers deserted all the time. The empire was vast, campaigns were grueling, and legionaries were human beings. And humans, especially when faced with 20 years of service in foreign provinces, occasionally decide they'd prefer a quiet farm life instead. But Rome was creative. Let's put it that way when it came to discouraging desertion. Most infamous methods was decimation. You may have heard of it. A unit that had disgraced itself, say, by deserting en masse or refusing orders would be lined up. Then every 10th man would be selected and executed by his comrades. Nothing builds team spirit, quite like forcing you to club your unlucky friend to death with a stick. This wasn't common, thankfully. Roman commanders used it sparingly, mostly as a theatrical display of authority. But the very fact it existed shows how seriously desertion was feared. Individual deserters could be flogged, branded, or executed outright. But interestingly, Roman law also recognized gradations of guilt. A man who fled in panic during battle might suffer a lesser penalty than someone who ran off before the fight even began. Context mattered, though usually not in a way that ended happily. Of course, not every deserter was punished. Some slipped away successfully. The empire was vast. The roads were busy, and not every runaway could be tracked down. Archaeologists have even found Roman tombstones of men who clearly reinvented themselves living out quiet lives far from their legions. There's a kind of quiet irony here. We imagine the Roman army as unstoppable, ironclad discipline, but at the edges of the empire, there were plenty of men just wandering off, trying not to be noticed. Let's wander further east for a moment to ancient China, because the problem was the same there, only on a larger scale. Chinese dynasties fielded enormous armies, often numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Many of these soldiers were conscripts, dragged from farms, handed basic weapons, and ordered to defend walls or march against nomadic raiders. Not everyone was enthusiastic. Desertion was punished harshly. In the Qin dynasty, the one famous for the terracotta army laws prescribed death for deserters. Entire families could even be implicated, which was a very effective way of discouraging men from running away. It's one thing to risk your own neck. It's another to know your wife, parents, and children might pay the price too. Still, deserters existed. Records describe them vanishing into the countryside, hiding in remote villages, or even joining rebel bands. Sometimes yesterday's deserter became tomorrow's warlord. History has a sense of humor like that. Now here's where it gets quietly amusing. In many cultures, deserters weren't just punished, they were also recycled. In Rome, for example, deserters who were caught might be forced to serve in penal units. Basically the ancient equivalent of you're going to the worst part of the battlefield and you probably won't come back. In medieval China, deserters could be branded and then used for hard labor or assigned to frontier garrisons where life expectancy was, well, let's just say short. It was punishment and practicality rolled into one. Why waste manpower after all? Even cowards could hold a shovel. Now perhaps the most human part of all this is motive. Why did men desert? Some fled out of fear naturally. Ancient battles were terrifying noise, blood, and chaos. Others deserted for family reasons, missing harvests, hungry children, or simply the desire to return home alive. And then there were deserters, motivated by boredom. Campaigns could drag on for years with little fighting and endless marching. At some point a soldier might just think, enough. What's striking is how universal it was. From Mesopotamia to Rome to China, the details differed, but the theme was the same. Ordinary men, pressed into extraordinary circumstances sometimes, choosing simply not to play along. And so what happened to them? If caught, usually disgrace or death. If lucky, a quiet disappearance. If very lucky, perhaps a new life under a new name. Occasionally, a deserter might even rise again, joining rebels, or rival armies and changing the course of history in some small way. But most, I suspect, simply melted back into obscurity. The kind of people who slip out of the story and never return, which in a way makes them rather relatable. After all, most of us, if handed a rusty spear and told to march across a desert for 20 years, would probably start eyeing the nearest exit. Take a moment. Picture those weary soldiers slipping into the shadows, choosing a quiet life over glory. It's a story as old as war itself.